When it comes to medical problems, there's nothing quite as mysterious as abdominal pain. And it's not just because of the discomfort it causes. It's because our abdomens have a ton of organs, so that pain could be coming from anywhere. Whether it's our stomachs, our intestines, our livers, our kidneys, there are so many vital components that can go haywire. And so on that note, today's episode features 2 stories about patients with horrible abdominal pain that ends up being caused by something totally unbelievable. The first story is about a young man backpacking through Nepal whose trip is derailed by a shocking trip to the hospital. And the second story is about a mysterious salmonella outbreak that sickened children all around Denver, Colorado, with one strange connection between all of them. And now, here is our first episode called A Clean Break. In the summer of 2023, a 22-year-old backpacker named Jeff was out late, drinking at a bar in Kathmandu, Nepal. Jeff had been traveling alone through South Asia over the past few weeks, and he just arrived in Kathmandu from India. So far, he loved Nepal. Over the past 2 days, he'd been exploring all the temples, markets, and food stalls that filled the bustling 2,000-year-old capital. He'd been going out to bars every night after dinner, hanging with locals and fellow tourists alike. Tonight, he'd chosen a bar that was full of people about his age, and the music was all Western pop tunes, so it sort of reminded him of being home. Jeff ordered a potent Nepalese drink called Roxy and struck up a conversation with the man on the next bar stool. He bought his new friend a Roxy as well, and they talked about Jeff's travels for a while. Then someone else joined the conversation, at which point Jeff decided it was time to buy some shots. By the time he paid his bar tab a few hours later, Jeff could barely see straight. He stood up from his bar stool, but he could hardly feel his feet. He only knew he was standing upright because he felt so dizzy. He staggered his way through the crowd. It felt like he was trudging through peanut butter. He swayed a little and stumbled backwards into the group of guys he'd been talking to all evening. They laughed at him, and one of the men gave him a playful push in the back, which sent him spinning into another group of men he didn't know. And these guys did not think the drunken man was so funny. They shoved Jeff back into his original group of friends, but a lot less gently this time. Soon enough, both groups were shoving and pushing, and the last thing Jeff remembered was the feel of someone's fist exploding against his cheekbone. The next morning, Jeff woke up in his hostel bed with the worst headache of his life. It felt like his head had been stuffed in a vice grip. He remembered getting punched the night before, but had no memory of what happened next or how he got home. Frankly, he was just glad to be back in his hostel bed and in one piece, even if his head was pounding. Jeff knew he had some painkillers in his bag somewhere, but the idea of just rifling through his belongings made him feel dizzy. So instead, he just reached for the half-empty bottle of water on his bedside and chugged it down in a single gulp. He felt better for about 30 seconds, but then vomit surged up his throat and he had to dive for the trash can on the far side of the room. He spent the next 5 minutes with his arms wrapped around the trash can, purging the contents of his stomach. It made him feel better, but he was still very achy and nauseous, and he also now had a sharp pain in his gut. It almost felt like he'd pulled a muscle in there or something. Jeff crawled back to his bed and flopped onto the mattress. He decided he would spend the rest of the day in bed, sleeping off this hangover. When Jeff finally woke up again later that day, the sun was setting outside his window. His headache was dull now, and the room had stopped spinning. But the pain in his gut felt sharper, and there was an edge to it that he'd never felt before. Now, Jeff didn't want to be alarmist, but he was all alone in a foreign country very far from home, and so he had this feeling that he should just go to the local emergency room and make sure everything was okay. After a quick dinner break, Dr. Anil Singh walked into the waiting room of the emergency department at the Shankarapur Hospital in Kathmandu. He called his next patient, a foreign tourist named Jeff. Dr. Singh specialized in gastrointestinal problems, and he'd been called down to take a look at Jeff's stomach. He led Jeff to a small examination room, and as they walked there, the doctor immediately noticed the smell of stale alcohol radiating off of Jeff. But he didn't say anything. Instead, once they got to the room, the doctor asked Jeff if he'd been experiencing any symptoms like constipation or stomach distension. And Jeff shook his head and said no. He said he had been hungover and he felt nauseous from it, but that was not why he was at the hospital. The reason he was at the hospital was because of this new shooting pain in his stomach. Dr. Singh nodded and then put on a fresh pair of latex gloves and told Jeff to lie down on the table. After he had, the doctor lifted up Jeff's shirt and instantly saw a large bandage taped over Jeff's abdomen. And then beneath it was a 3-inch long cut with fresh sutures stitching up his skin. Whoever had done the sutures had done a good job, but Dr. Singh was pretty certain this was why Jeff's stomach hurt. He told Jeff that his sutures looked clean and asked where he got the injury. But Jeff looked so confused. He looked at his stomach and then back up at Dr. Singh with this horrified look on his face. Jeff said he had no idea where that injury even came from. He said he remembered getting punched in the face last night at the bar, but had no memory of anything after that, certainly didn't recall getting cut or seeing any kind of doctor who might have stitched him up. Dr. Singh cocked an eyebrow and looked at Jeff like, really? You had no idea you had a wound on your stomach? But as Jeff continued to look totally shocked by this wound, the doctor concluded that maybe Jeff really was telling the truth, that he really didn't know about this cut. And so Dr. Singh examined the wound more closely and told Jeff that it looked like someone had cut him open, like that's what the injury was, you've been cut. And so Dr. Singh ordered an x-ray just to see what was going on in there. Jeff nodded like he understood, but his eyes were staring off into the distance and he had a totally frightened look on his face. He asked the doctor if it was possible that someone had stolen an organ from him while he was blacked out drunk. He'd always heard that in some countries there was a black market for kidneys, but Dr. Singh smiled and told him that that probably did not happen to him. An hour later, Dr. Singh received Jeff's x-ray, and when he pulled it up on his computer to take a look, he was absolutely floored. And so he rushed back to Jeff's hospital room and asked him to tell him whatever he could remember about the night before. And so Jeff saw the urgency on the doctor's face, but admitted that as much as he wanted to remember, it really was all a blur. He remembered drinking way too much and getting punched in the face at some point, but he had no idea how he had gotten back to his hostel room after that. Dr. Singh was in awe of how drunk Jeff must have been to have basically no memory of the night before. But he told Jeff that ultimately he would be okay, but based on his x-ray, he would have to get in the operating room right away. He needed immediate surgery. Jeff, who was already pale, got even paler and asked Dr. Singh to explain what was wrong with him. What did he find? Dr. Singh sighed, sat down next to Jeff, and then broke the incredible news. The moment those x-ray images came back, Dr. Singh knew exactly what was causing Jeff's discomfort. There was a 6-inch long knife blade lodged inside of Jeff's body. Dr. Singh told Jeff that at some point the night before, he must have been stabbed, and apparently stabbed so hard that the knife blade had broken off inside of his abdomen. And somehow, Jeff was so drunk, he didn't remember any of it. Dr. Singh decided to call the bar, hoping that somebody there would know the whole story. And luckily, the bartender who answered the phone had been working there the night before and had seen the whole thing. Jeff had made some friends at the bar last night, but apparently he had made some enemies too. And during the physical altercation that ensued with these enemies, someone stabbed Jeff with what looked like a chef's knife, and then one of the onlookers took Jeff to the nearest medical shop, which are these 24-hour pharmacies that can be found all over Kathmandu. And so once they got there, the onlooker begged the shop owner to sew Jeff up, and the shop owner did, even though he was not a doctor. And because he was not a doctor, the shop owner, before stitching him up, didn't think to check whether there were any foreign objects inside of Jeff first, hence the knife being left inside of Jeff. And then afterwards, when Jeff was sleeping off his hangover back at his hostel, that knife blade traveled inside of him through his innards until it was lodged deep inside of Jeff's torso. It was a miracle that it didn't cause further damage to Jeff's internal organs as it worked its way deeper into the muscle of his abdominal cavity. And so it was no wonder Jeff was in extreme pain by the time he got to the ER. Jeff was taken to the operating room, where surgeons were able to extract the knife blade from his abdominal cavity. Then they patched him up, and he was discharged from the hospital 5 days later. Ultimately, Jeff would travel back to his home country once he was healthy enough to travel, and although he couldn't remember the most exciting part of his trip, getting stabbed, he would always have the scar as a souvenir. And now, here's our second story, called Look, Don't Touch. On the morning of January 14th, 1996, Alana Rugen carried her 6-year-old son, Jaden, as they walked towards the Tropical Discovery Center at the Denver Zoo. She was eager to get out of the cold, especially since most of the exhibits they'd visited so far had been outside. They'd seen the penguins, the tigers, and the gorillas, but Jaden loved snakes, so the reptiles at the Discovery Center were like the main event. Alana let Jaden run ahead of her as they entered the building. And then after going inside and collecting her son, they went to sit in a little auditorium that normally showed a short reptile documentary. But this afternoon, the movie was turned off, and 2 zookeepers were welcoming a small crowd to fill the seats. After the audience was seated, the zookeepers began bringing out all kinds of snakes and lizards and tortoises, holding them up for the kids to see, and also telling the audience all about the animals and where they came from. Alana watched her son's eyes light up when they brought out a massive 12-foot-long boa constrictor and stretched him out on the floor, his forked tongue flicking in and out of his mouth. Alana was thrilled that she'd signed her son up for this little excursion. He seemed to be really enjoying it so far. Just then, one of the zookeepers carried a lizard into the bleachers so the kids could get a closer look. Jaden immediately reached out his hand to try and pet the lizard, but Alana grabbed him and pulled his hand back before he could make contact. The zookeepers had been very clear that this event was a reptile meet and greet, not a meet and touch. By the time the show was over, Jaden was buzzing. He was jumping up and down and telling his mom all about his favorite animals and what he remembered about each one. She smiled as she led him to the next exhibit, called Komodo Days. It was a limited-time indoor exhibit that had just opened a few days earlier, showcasing 4 of the largest lizards on Earth, called Komodo dragons. Each of the animals was bigger than Jaden, and that was actually still small for a Komodo dragon. Alana overheard someone reading from a plaque that said these animals could grow up to 10 feet long and weigh about 350 pounds. The zoo was hoping to raise enough funds to build a large permanent enclosure for these new arrivals to the zoo. For the time being, though, these giant lizards were being kept in a temporary exhibit, enclosed by a 2-foot-tall wooden barrier, which the lizards were not capable of climbing over. To make sure nobody got too close, there was a line of plants in front of the barrier, all surrounded by a chain and post fence. Alana was more than happy to keep her distance. She had to admit that the Komodo dragons were cool, although their exhibit smelled horrible, like damp mulch and manure. But Jaden was so excited, he barely seemed to notice. Alana stood with Jaden right behind the fence, and from where they were standing, they had a good view into the enclosure. Alana thought the dragons looked a bit like alligators, with big heads and short stubby legs and long muscular tails. She then leaned over and began to read from the plaque of animal facts fastened to the barrier. She told Jaden that apparently these dragons were poisonous and had razor-sharp teeth, and they eat almost any kind of meat, from rodents to water buffaloes. Jaden listened and watched in fascination as the dragons lumbered around their enclosure, their big nails crunching on the mulch that had been put on the floor. He giggled as one of the dragons stood up on a rock and stuck its big yellow tongue out, hissing at the crowd. Jaden was so entranced by these dragons that he leaned over the fence to get a better look, and actually reached towards a Komodo dragon that was only a few feet away, near the edge of its enclosure. And as this happened, that same dragon put its paws up on the 2-foot wooden wall to get a better look at Jaden. Alana saw this and gasped and grabbed her son and pulled him back. All that was separating him from one of the deadliest predators on Earth was a line of decorative bushes. Thankfully, she had pulled him away in time, although it felt way too close for comfort. Alana let Jaden continue to watch the Komodo dragons, but this time a little bit farther back from the barrier. And then after about 15 minutes, Alana's stomach began to rumble, so she told her son they needed to leave now, but they would stop at the cafeteria and grab some food before heading home. A few mornings later, Alana went upstairs to wake her son for school. But when she entered Jaden's room, he complained that his stomach hurt, and he was afraid that he was going to throw up. Now, normally Jaden was pretty enthusiastic about school, so Alana decided he must really be sick. So she told him he would stay home today and rest up, and then she went and got him some Gatorade. A few hours later, Alana was in the kitchen grabbing saltine crackers for Jaden when she heard him cry upstairs. She ran upstairs and found him still in bed, but now sweating with a fever and shivering with chills at the same time. When she took his temperature, it read 104 degrees. Alana was shocked. This seemed more serious than just a 24-hour bug, and so she decided to bring him to the doctor. But before they left to go see the doctor, she had Jaden use the bathroom and discovered he was passing bloody diarrhea, which really scared her. Once he was cleaned up, she rushed him out the front door and sped to the hospital as fast as she could. About 10 days later, on January 26th, Dr. Barbara Raffa knocked on Alana's front door. Dr. Raffa was an investigator with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment and had recently learned that Jaden was one of 7 children in the Denver metro area who had been infected with a strain of salmonella called Salmonella enteritis that's commonly found in poultry and other animals. Dr. Raffa and her team were trying to figure out where the children had picked up the salmonella bacteria, which is usually spread by consuming contaminated food or water or having contact with infected animals. The doctor reassured Alana that most people recover from a salmonella infection, but it can be dangerous to young kids. In fact, if kids go untreated for salmonella, they can die. Dr. Raffa had spent the past few days interviewing the families with the kids who were sick with salmonella and had asked hospitals to report any new cases. She had the sinking feeling that this was the beginning of an outbreak, so she and her team needed to act fast to figure out what was going on here. Alana knew her son had salmonella poisoning, but had no idea that other kids were also getting salmonella poisoning too. Dr. Raffa followed Alana to the kitchen, and the pair sat down at the kitchen table, and Dr. Raffa asked how Jaden was doing. Alana said her son was upstairs sleeping and still was a bit tired and weak, but he seemed to be recovering. She had taken him to the emergency room last week, where he was diagnosed with salmonella based on his symptoms. He'd been given fluids and antibiotics, which had definitely helped him get better. The hospital monitored him for a few days until the salmonella had passed through his body. Dr. Raffa told Alana how relieved she was that Jaden was okay. But now she was hoping to try to stop the spread of the salmonella strain before it affected more kids. And so she said she had a list of questions she wanted to ask Alana in the hopes that maybe she could help her figure out exactly how Jaden got sick. Alana nodded and said she was eager to help. Dr. Raffa began by asking if she and her son had gone anywhere unusual over the past 2 weeks. Alana shrugged and said not really, except they did go to the zoo the weekend before last. She said they'd gone to see the reptiles. By now, Dr. Raffa had been expecting this answer. Every other family she'd spoken to whose kid was sick with salmonella told her they had gone to the Discovery Center at the zoo, which made it obvious to Dr. Raffa that this particular strain of salmonella had to be stemming from something in that building. So now it was time to head to the zoo and figure out what that might be. The next day, Dr. Raffa and her colleagues arrived at the Tropical Discovery Center. As the zookeeper led her and her colleagues through the employees-only area of the exhibit, Dr. Raffa felt a sense of urgency. By now, Dr. Raffa had identified 33 children who had contracted the same strain of salmonella as Jaden over the past 2 weeks. And each family had this one thing in common. They had all visited this Discovery Center. And so now it was extremely apparent that something in this building was behind the kids getting sick. And for all Dr. Raffa knew, kids were actively being exposed to salmonella right now. So far, they'd been lucky. All 33 families of the sick kids had taken their children to a hospital, so they were all going to be fine. However, Dr. Raffa worried that eventually, if this outbreak continued, that a family would think whatever was going on with their kids was just a mild stomach bug. And then by the time they realized their mistake, it would be too late for their child. She pushed that thought from her mind and went back to work. She had to figure out which animal or exhibit was carrying the salmonella bacteria, and most importantly, how the kids were coming into contact with it. And that was proving to be a real mystery. As Dr. Raffa walked through the Discovery Center, she noticed that almost all of the exhibits were completely sealed off. There was no way for the public to come in contact directly with any of the reptiles or any of their environments. She asked the zookeeper about the animals they used in their daily education shows. She wondered if maybe the kids were allowed to touch any of them. But the zookeeper shook his head. He told her that the public never touched any of the animals because that was unsafe for both the people and the animals. But Dr. Raffa wasn't convinced. She said she wanted stool samples from all of the education animals just to make sure they weren't carrying the salmonella bacteria. She also wanted samples from the rodents that were used to feed those animals, because she was not going to take any chances. About 20 minutes later, Dr. Rafa scooped up a bit of fecal matter from a blue-tongued skink and dropped it into a tiny plastic tube. Then she labeled it for testing back in the lab. Along the back hallway, her teammates were collecting stool samples from corn snakes, the big boa constrictor, and all the other reptiles used in the daily show. And they were making good progress, which she was glad for. She kept imagining a sick child in bed at home, their parents unaware that their stomach bug was actually a potentially deadly disease from their trip to the zoo. She hurried the sample she had just collected to a small examination room down the hallway, an area that was usually for veterinary visits, but that her team was using now as a home base while they examined the Discovery Center. And when she got there, it was then that Dr. Rafa remembered the Komodo dragon exhibit that they had passed on the way in. She had a thought. The Komodo dragons were a new exhibit. And even though the Komodo dragons were kept out of reach of the public, the timing of their arrival and the outbreak of this disease was too close to ignore. Curious, she went to find the zookeeper. She wanted samples from all 4 of the dragons, hoping that her gut feeling would solve this mystery. On the morning of February 1st, so about 2 weeks after Jaden got sick, Dr. Paul Nelson arrived at the Denver Zoo, alongside a small team of fellow investigators from the Centers for Disease Control, or CDC. A few days earlier, all the samples that Dr. Rafa had collected came back from the lab, and all of the animals were salmonella-free except one, a Komodo dragon. And it tested positive for the exact strain of salmonella that had infected all the children. So now, Dr. Rafa had clearly identified the source of the salmonella outbreak, but an equally important question was looming. How could the kids come into contact with the bacteria that was on this Komodo dragon when they and the public were not allowed to touch the Komodo dragons in the first place? The dragons and the public were clearly separated by a low plywood wall, a row of bushes, and a fence. And so Dr. Rafa was stumped, and that's why she had called the CDC to take over the case. A zoo administrator welcomed Dr. Nelson and his colleagues into the Discovery Center and then led them into a back room where 6 other zoo employees were waiting. Most of them were the zookeepers who worked directly with the infected Komodo dragon. And so Dr. Nelson said he needed stool samples from all of them to make sure that none of them were sick and spreading the salmonella strain themselves when they interacted with the public. Dr. Nelson also said they would need additional fecal samples from some of the animals at the center just to play it safe. And then after that, Dr. Nelson's teammates spread out all across the Discovery Center and began collecting samples of their own. Not fecal samples, but surface samples. They were swabbing basically every surface they possibly could. Everything from the plants to the fences to the mulch on the ground. By the time Dr. Nelson and his team left the zoo an hour later, they had this massive bag full of samples to test. About 5 days later, Dr. Nelson returned to the Discovery Center with surprising news about the CDC's analysis of all the samples they had taken. In addition to finding the salmonella strain in the Komodo dragon's stool, they had also found the salmonella strain in a very unlikely place. It was sitting on top of the wooden barrier that was supposed to keep the dragons away from the public. Dr. Nelson admitted to the zoo officials that he was really confused. And so he just kind of began walking around near the Komodo dragon enclosure, wondering, how could the salmonella get there? And right as he walked over to the fence, he noticed one of the dragons walking over to him to kind of check him out. And a second later, the dragon stood up on its hind legs and propped its paws right on the wooden barrier. And suddenly, it all made sense. It would turn out the Komodo dragon enclosure was covered with mulch. The Komodo dragons slept in that mulch, walked in that mulch, and went to the bathroom in that mulch. Then they occasionally put their feet up on the wooden barrier to get a better look at their guests, transferring bits of salmonella-infected mulch and fecal matter onto the wooden fence in the process. The children, meanwhile, were so excited to see these giant lizards that they were leaning way over the security fence and sometimes actually touching the top of the wooden barrier. They didn't know it, but they were actually getting salmonella on their hands. And so at that point, if the kids didn't wash their hands, all they would have to do to get infected with the salmonella would be to just brush their nose or rub their eyes, or in Jaden's case, eat some food with their bare hands. Thankfully, the salmonella outbreak was treated fast enough that all 33 infected children made full recoveries. And the Denver Zoo managed to raise enough money for the Komodo dragon exhibit that they could build a permanent enclosure, this one completely sealed off from the public. It's actually still at the Denver Zoo today, and there has not been a single salmonella outbreak in nearly 2 decades. In 2006, Heather Kwan was a 21-year-old college student living in the small residential town of Desert Hills in Arizona. From a very young age, Heather was someone who always seemed to give her friendship to the people who needed it the most, people who were hurting on the inside or who society had kind of forgotten about. This is why when she was a teenager and a young adult, she would often spend her weekends volunteering her time with underprivileged children. It's also why she aspired to go to law school and become a defense lawyer, because she loved the idea of professionally helping people that desperately needed her help. She lived in a rental home with her boyfriend, who was 18 years old. His name was Ryan Waller, and amongst other things, he was a huge gun enthusiast and a student. That year, the couple had made plans to visit Ryan's father, Don, on Christmas Day, so on December 25th. But when the day came and Don had made dinner for the couple and was expecting them, they didn't show up. And so Don tried contacting both of them, but when he couldn't, he just had a bad feeling that something was off. It was just very uncharacteristic of them to just no-show. But instead of driving over to their property himself, Don just called the local police and asked them to do a welfare check. The police arrived at the house in Desert Hills, Arizona. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. They looked in the windows and some lights were on, but it was mostly dark inside, and they couldn't really tell from the car in the driveway if that belonged to the homeowners or somebody else. And so they stood there for a second, they're looking in the windows, there's no movement. They knock again while simultaneously calling out that, hey, we're the police, we're here to do a welfare check, just want to make sure you guys are okay. And this time, after they were done knocking, they heard the deadbolt unlock and then the door swung inward into the house, and standing right in front of them was Ryan. Ryan had this huge bruise on his left eye, this big black eye, and he had a cut on his nose, and he was just standing there, not saying anything, not asking any questions, just looking at them. And they looked past Ryan into his house, and they saw there was a woman lying on the couch, which they presumed was his girlfriend Heather, because that was the two people they were coming to look for. And so they turned their attention back to Ryan, and they asked him, what happened to your eye? And Ryan was a little bit cagey. He didn't really give them a straight answer. He basically said, I don't know. I don't know what happened to my eye. And, the police didn't really pry that much, but eventually they determined that Ryan was more or less okay, albeit a little bit strange. And then they said, okay, well, who's the woman who's lying on the couch? Is that Heather? And Ryan, again, was kind of cagey and a little bit dismissive and said something along the lines of, she's just sleeping. And so the police said to him, look, we're here on a welfare check. Your father sent us here to check on you guys. And so we have to go in there and wake her up and make sure she's okay. And so Ryan, again, was just a little bit weird and kind of defensive and didn't really immediately comply, but eventually did step out of the way. And the police walked into the residence. They walked over to the couch. And as soon as they looked down at the girl on the couch, which was Heather, they saw right away that she was not asleep. She was dead. And she had been for at least a couple of days. She had died from a single gunshot wound to the head. Immediately, Ryan was arrested and brought out to a squad car. He didn't fight the arrest, but he did emphatically say he didn't know what was going on, he didn't understand what was happening, he didn't know what happened to Heather. He just seemed kind of generally confused. But regardless, he was thrown in the back of the police car outside the property, and he would sit there for several hours while more and more police and paramedics arrived to process the crime scene and also to transfer Heather's body to a morgue. Finally, around 5 a.m. on December 26th, the police brought Ryan, who was still in the back of this police car, to the Phoenix police station for questioning. The interrogation that followed, this hour-long interrogation that was all filmed, would start off relatively normally, but it would quickly devolve into this totally bizarre back and forth between Ryan and the detective who was questioning him. And then at the end of the interrogation, there would be this stunning revelation. From this point until the end of today's video, we're going to be showing you clips from the actual interrogation. When you get to the end of this video and you hear the revelation, and trust me, you will not miss it, I would encourage you to then go back and watch the clips of the interrogation, or just go online and watch the entire interrogation, because it's totally mind-blowing watching this thing, knowing what's really going on. In the video, Ryan is led into this sort of nondescript, small interrogation room at 5:08 a.m. on December 26th. So he's just arrived at the station. They put him in this room. He's wearing this white jumpsuit that might have been issued by police. Maybe he owned it, but it definitely looks more like prison attire. He's got no shoes on, no socks on, and his hands are not cuffed. And so he walks into the room and he sits down in the chair that's in the back corner of the interrogation room. And this chair is right next to this table. And then on the other side of this table is another chair. And so Ryan sits down in the corner. He's kind of facing out towards the middle of the room. He's quiet. He's basically not moving. And then at some point, he notices there is a handcuff that's connected to this table. Now, in some cases, the police would handcuff the person they were interviewing in this room. But in this case, Ryan was not told that he needed to put this handcuff on. He was uncuffed. So there was no directive that he needed to have this handcuff on. After handcuffing himself to this table, Ryan turns and puts his arms over this table and he lays down, puts his head in his arms, and he lays that way for about 5 minutes. Periodically, he makes a few groaning sounds, but for the most part, he's quiet. And then all of a sudden, as he's laying there, he suddenly makes a fairly loud moaning sound and he stands up in his chair like he's gonna walk out of the room, but as soon as he starts to walk away, the handcuff stops him. The handcuff that he was not told to put on. And so he's stuck against this table, but he doesn't seem fazed by it. He looks almost confused by what's happening, but he doesn't dwell on it for very long. Instead, he just reaches across the table and grabs a blank piece of paper, and then he just sits back down in the seat, he crosses his legs, and he starts looking at this piece of paper. At 5:17 a.m., so roughly 9 minutes into this interrogation, which really hasn't even started yet, Ryan is intently looking at this blank piece of paper when a detective walks into the interrogation room. This detective was named Dalton, and he informs Ryan that they're going to be taking pictures of his feet, and so he needs to put his feet up on the table that's right next to him. Ryan at first acts very confused and doesn't really understand what's happening, but he eventually complies and he puts his feet up on the table, and by the time his feet are up there, another officer walks into the interrogation room, and he's got a camera and he's got this big kit with him, and he would begin about a 10-minute long process of photographing Ryan's feet and also swabbing Ryan's feet. During this 10-minute session, Dalton stays in the room, and so Ryan periodically asks him if he can just leave and go home, seemingly unaware of how serious this situation really was for him. And when Dalton would tell him, "No, you can't leave," Ryan would act totally frustrated and kind of angry and upset, kind of like how a child would act if they were told they couldn't have something they really wanted to. At 5:28 a.m., after this 10-minute session is complete and they've photographed and swabbed Ryan's feet, the second officer leaves the room, and Dalton shuts the door behind him, and then he walks over to the table and he grabs the chair on the other side from Ryan. He drags it out so it's closer to Ryan, and then he sits down and introduces himself. After that, he begins asking Ryan some very basic questions. He asks him to confirm his name, which he does. He asks him to confirm his date of birth and his social security number, and Ryan does both those things. And then he asks Ryan if he understands why he was there, why he was being interrogated. And Ryan says, no. And so at this point, Dalton says, okay, let's just stop right now. I'm going to read you your rights. And so it's at this point in the interrogation that Ryan's behavior starts to get really, really weird. After Dalton tells Ryan he needs to read him his rights, you can see Ryan doesn't compute what he's saying. He's just kind of looking blankly, and Dalton seems to pick up on that. And so he tries to make it kind of lighthearted, and he says, hey, Ryan, I'm going to read you your rights like they do on TV, like on Cops and on Law and Order and CSI, any of those crime shows, they read people their rights. That's what I'm going to do. You know what I'm talking about? And Ryan just goes, no. And Dalton's kind of confused. He's like, you haven't seen any cop show where they read people their rights? And at this, Ryan kind of changes his behavior. And suddenly he's not as robotic. He's a little bit defensive looking. And he says, oh, yeah, I have, yeah. At this, it's pretty obvious to Dalton that Ryan is lying about something that is totally insignificant. Whether or not he's seen true crime TV shows, it really just didn't matter at all. And there's this weird hesitation where both of them are just kind of being quiet for a minute. It's like Dalton knows he's lying about it, and Ryan just seems totally confused. And then ultimately, Dalton just decides to not key in on this kind of weird lie that Ryan has just told. Instead, he just reads Ryan his rights. And then after that, he gets back into some basic questions. The next one was, hey Ryan, what was the highest grade you achieved in school? And now at this point, Ryan is not looking at Dalton. He's looking to the far side of the room. He's got this blank expression on. And when he's asked this question, he just says, I don't know. And Dalton's like, you don't know what level grade you achieved in school? And Ryan says, no, I don't know. Eighth grade. So again, he's changed his answer fairly abruptly when he's challenged. And so Dalton is probably thinking to himself that he's lying again. But again, it's just kind of an insignificant thing, but it's building a pattern of mistrust here. It's hard for Dalton to believe that Ryan is going to be truthful if he can't even tell the truth about things that don't matter. But Dalton decides not to fixate on it. Instead, he asks a follow-up question based on the fact that Ryan has said 8th grade is the highest level he achieved. And so Dalton says, okay, well, did you get your GED? A GED is a high school diploma equivalent, and it's something you would get if you did not graduate high school. And since 8th grade is below high school, then Ryan clearly did not finish high school. And so it's a natural question to ask. The answer to this question is binary. You have a GED, you don't have a GED. But Ryan's answer is anything but binary. It's totally contradictory and weird, and it really begins to show a side of Ryan that just doesn't add up. He's acting totally weird.
Do you have a GED?
I don't know.
You don't know what?
I don't know. I don't know. I just want to go home.
Oh, you're not going to go home right now.
So what?
What's the highest grade that you completed?
B?
No, not grade, as in letter grade. I'm asking, did you graduate high school?
No.
And the highest you went was 8th grade?
Yep.
Do you know how to read and write, Ryan?
Yeah.
After the discussion about Ryan's education goes nowhere, Dalton again does not fixate on all the issues with his answers so far, and instead just kind of continues asking more questions. And so he begins to address Heather. He starts by asking Ryan if he has a girlfriend. Now, Dalton at this point would know that Heather, the girl who was deceased, was Ryan's girlfriend because the police were asked to do the initial welfare check on Ryan and Heather, the couple. That's something that Dawn would have relayed to police. And so Dalton knows they have a relationship, but he wants Ryan to tell him he has a relationship with Heather. So again, he asks Ryan, do you have a girlfriend? And Ryan says no, which is a lie. But Dalton goes along with it and says, okay, well, do you know a girl named Heather? And Ryan would say, yes, I do. But his description of Heather was just completely inaccurate. He said Heather was a 16 or 17-year-old girl, even though she was actually 21. And he would say her last name was Kyman. He thought. He wasn't entirely sure. He said she has nicknames and she has different names she uses, but he believes it's Kyman, even though her last name was actually Kwan. Now, Dalton, of course, is aware of these discrepancies, but again, he does not fixate on them. He just keeps on asking more questions. Dalton asks Ryan, what happened to your face? You have this huge bruise on the left side of your face. What happened? At first, Ryan says he doesn't know. But when Dalton pressed him and kept asking more and more questions about his face and how it happened, Ryan eventually would begin to open up.
What happened to your face?
I don't know.
You told the officer just a few minutes ago that someone hit you. Do you remember who hit you?
I don't know. I think it was Heather.
Why would Heather hit you?
I don't know. It was an accident. I forgot why.
Like the other police officers involved, Dalton believed already going into this interrogation that Ryan killed Heather, that the bruise on his face was from Heather fighting back before ultimately Ryan killed her. And so for Ryan to say the mark on my face is from Heather, even though he claimed it was an accident, to Dalton, that was the same thing as Ryan saying, I killed Heather. Dalton attempted to get more specific details about the actual physical struggle that took place between Ryan and Heather, but as he asked more and more questions, he became more and more aggressive, and it seemed like Ryan picked up on it and became very defensive and started throwing out random pieces of information, much of which seemed untrue. Like he suggested there was at least 2 or 3 other people that were in the house on the night that Heather got killed, but it's unclear if these people were real or if they were actually ever there. And it just seemed like Ryan was kind of panicking and just kind of saying all sorts of random things. And so at some point, Dalton just wants to focus the conversation because he feels like it's getting totally out of hand. And so he just stops Ryan and he says, Ryan, there is a dead girl in your house and I need information.
Hey, Ryan?
Huh? Huh?
There's a dead girl in your living room.
She's dead?
Yes.
Heather?
I don't know. I want to know what happened in your house last night.
The girl on the couch is dead?
I don't know if she's on the couch. She's dead.
The interesting thing about Ryan's reaction to being told by Dalton for the first time in the interrogation that there was a dead girl in his house is Ryan reacted with genuine surprise. It's the only time in the entire interrogation start to finish where Ryan sits forward in his chair, he kind of perks up, and he seems relatively normal. He's not acting confused and kind of bizarre. It's like he's really dialed in, as if he had not heard this before, that he didn't know Heather was dead, and he's now for the first time being told, and it shocked his system. But just seconds after he sits forward and seems really engaged, he goes back to kind of being totally bizarre, and he also suddenly had this really elaborate story about what happened to Heather, even though just seconds ago it seemed like he had just learned about it. So it didn't really make any sense that he would have a story so readily available for something he seemed to not know anything about. And of course, like all of his other answers, his story he gave was full of contradictions and holes and was just totally unbelievable.
Well, these people came over, Richie and his dad, with shoot and arrow, bow and darts. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
They hit me and her with those. That's it.
They hit you and they hit you?
Yeah.
Now it's Richie that hit you, not Heather?
No, Richie and his dad.
Richie and his dad. They hit you.
Yes.
Why?
Because they're trying to get their stuff. I don't know why.
And they had some kind of bow and arrows?
Mm-hmm. They each had 2 revolvers and they didn't let off any shells.
Okay, you just said they had bow and arrows. Now they have revolvers?
That's what I meant. They had revolvers.
They have revolvers.
Yes.
And then what happened?
And then they shot us with those.
Following this exchange, Ryan would change his story again and would say, actually, they didn't shoot me, they just shot Heather, they put me in a sleeper hold. But when Dalton asked him, what do you mean sleeper hold? Ryan said, oh, I don't know what a sleeper hold is. And then eventually, Ryan would actually just ditch the sleeper hold narrative and go back to the Richie and his father, they came in and they shot both of us. At this point, Ryan's story has become so convoluted and it's changed so many times that it's just totally unbelievable. And so Dalton, who was doing his best to kind of go along with Ryan's story, at this point just can't even pretend anymore. He cannot pretend that he's following this story. It doesn't make any sense.
You're telling me you're all over the board here, number one. You're saying bows and arrows, you're saying revolvers, and you're saying some other thing, and you're saying they shot you in the eye. Okay? They shot you with a revolver in your eye.
Yes. And that's
Is it a BB gun?
No, it was a real gun, man. It was just a
If
revolver.
they shot you in the eye with a revolver, you wouldn't be talking to me right now.
How do you know?
It was most likely you be dead.
That's what I thought too, man. I really don't know.
So you got shot first,
Uh-huh.
and what happened? Did you fall to the ground?
Yeah, I was trying to get up and I couldn't. I don't
Okay.
know.
And then she got shot?
Mm-hmm.
What did you do?
Nothing.
Did you call 911? Did you see if she was alive?
She was sleeping still, and that's it. I just let her sleep.
She got shot in the side of the face, and you let her sleep?
Yes.
This does not make sense, Ryan.
After this exchange, Dalton just goes full bad cop on Ryan, openly accusing him of shooting and killing Heather, and Ryan just continues to say he doesn't know anything, that he didn't do it, and his answers are just totally nonsensical and contradictory, and nothing is making sense. And so finally, at 5:52 a.m., roughly 45 minutes into this interrogation, Dalton is just at a loss. He does not know how to handle Ryan, because even though he really believes he did it, nothing Ryan has said has incriminated him, because nothing Ryan has said makes any sense. And so he's sitting there kind of thinking what he's going to do next, and then Dalton notices something. He notices something on Ryan's face. And he tells Ryan to come closer. He needs to look at it.
Let me see your nose. Put your legs down. Put your legs down. Bring your face closer.
Oh, my head hurts.
Okay. Yeah, be right back.
What Dalton had finally just discovered were 4 bullet holes in Ryan's face and head. Ryan had committed no crime. He was a victim the same way Heather was a victim, but somehow Ryan had survived the attack. On December 23rd, so 2 days before the welfare check, 2 men attempted to break into Ryan and Heather's house. They were 23-year-old Richie Carver and his 54-year-old father, Larry Carver, the same Richie and Richie's father that Ryan had mentioned during the interrogation. They were there because of an altercation that had occurred between Richie and the couple about a month earlier. During that time, Richie was actually living with Ryan and Heather, but apparently he began hitting on Heather, and Heather told Ryan, and Ryan got really mad about it, and Ryan and Richie got in this big fight, and ultimately Ryan kicks Richie out of the house. Now, this totally infuriates Richie and is very embarrassing for Richie, and so right away, he begins plotting his revenge. And so on December 23rd, Richie and his father, they were there to carry out this revenge plot. When the father and son got to the back of Ryan and Heather's house, Ryan saw them at the back door through the glass door that was near their kitchen, and he ran over to try to stop them from getting inside, but Richie and Larry managed to barely get open the door, and Richie reached in with his hand, which was carrying a gun, and he shot Ryan point blank twice in the face. The first bullet went in through his nose and then out the other side of his nose, so that's the first 2 bullet holes. And then that bullet traveled back into his head through his left eye into his brain where it got lodged. And along with the bullet, 6 pieces of his skull that broke off from this bullet went inside of his brain as well. So that's the first 3 bullet holes. And then the second bullet that was fired into Ryan's head hit the side of his head. It did not penetrate into his skull. So the bullet didn't lodge anywhere inside of his brain. However, it did break off a piece of his skull. And so that was the 4th bullet hole. Ryan dropped to the ground. He was unconscious. They assumed he was dead. They managed to force the door the rest of the way open. They stepped inside. They stepped over Ryan's body, and they walked into the living room where Heather was cowering on the sofa, and Richie just immediately walked up, put a gun to her head, and fired a single shot. After she had fallen to the ground, the 2 men stole some things in the house and then fled the scene. They would ultimately get caught, and they're both currently serving life sentences. It's believed Heather died instantly from her gunshot wound, but Ryan didn't. At some point, maybe a couple of hours after he was shot, he woke up, but he had severe brain damage and he wouldn't have known what was going on. He didn't really know what happened, and he saw his girlfriend Heather lying on the couch, but he thought she was just sleeping, and so he too went to his bedroom and he fell asleep. But the next morning, he woke up and he still would have had no idea what was going on, and he spent the day on the 24th just kind of wandering around his house with his girlfriend lying dead on the couch. And so after a full day of just kind of mindlessly walking around his house, he went back to bed, and then he got up on Christmas Day on the 25th and spent another day just kind of walking about his house with his girlfriend, who he believed was sleeping, but really she was dead. And so finally the welfare check is called in, the police show up, and as soon as they see Ryan, they jumped to conclusions that he must have killed Heather, and it kind of dictated the way they treated him. Had they believed he was a victim, they might have sought medical attention for the wound on his face, but again, jumping to conclusions and assuming he was the killer, they figured that bruise on his face was from the woman fighting back. She had struck him before he had savagely killed her. And so they didn't give him any medical care. Instead, they put him out in the cop car out front of the property, and he sat there with no medical intervention for 6 hours. And during those 6 hours, literally every second that went by, there was irreversible brain damage being caused because he had all this bleeding inside of his head that was causing brain damage. And so the clock was ticking as soon as they found him, and for hours and hours and hours, he got no care and was just getting worse and worse and worse. And so finally he goes to the police station, and again, they do not give him any medical care. Instead, they interrogate him for almost 2 hours, even though he has 4 bullet holes on his face that apparently no one noticed or no one took seriously. But regardless, he spent those almost 2 more hours in the interrogation room, where every second that's going by, his brain is getting more and more destroyed, irreparably destroyed. And then finally, at the end of the interrogation, Dalton, who's probably thinking to himself, what is wrong with this guy? His answers don't make any sense. He's all over the place. And that's when he stepped back from looking for a way to convict this guy and noticed the holes on his face, specifically the hole in his nose. And that's when he called him forward, and he looked at his face and he realized a huge mistake had been made, and he called an ambulance. Here is a clip of the fire department who arrived ahead of the ambulance in the interrogation room, learning about what's happened to Ryan as they wait for the ambulance.
Hi guys. Hey guys. Captain, you're not going to believe this one.
I can't believe it either. You're right. I've already heard the story. I can't believe it.
This is just my observations that this might be an entrance, this might be an exit, this might be into his eye. And he's acting like he has a serious head injury, which would make sense.
Ryan was ultimately rushed to the hospital, where he would undergo emergency surgery that would save his life, but it would come at a great cost. They not only had to remove a large portion of his brain, but they also had to remove both of his eyes. Now, it should be noted that at least one other source says he only had his left eye removed, but regardless, after this surgery, Ryan was no longer independent. He had so much brain damage, he couldn't take care of himself, and so he had to move back in with his parents, who became his full-time caretakers. And then 10 years later, Ryan would die from a seizure that was directly connected to the injuries he sustained from that attack, and it's connected to the lack of care he received in those first critical 8 hours after the police found him. The Phoenix Police Department, after this mishandling of Ryan's case went public, they did an internal investigation, but no one was ever disciplined, at least not publicly. As for Ryan's family, they certainly could have filed a lawsuit against the Phoenix Police Department, but they chose not to. They said, the only thing we want is our son back, and a lawsuit will not give us that.